It all started with a cardboard package that arrived 2 days after the funeral. No return address. No note. Just Edward Brewer's name, handwritten, barely legible, and an old Army serial number ink-stamped in red across the side, hashtag 042-13-076. He knew the handwriting. It belonged to Martin, his younger brother. They hadn't spoken in years. Not since 1987, when Martin moved to Arizona, said he wanted to disappear from anything that looked like a federal file. Edward thought he'd been drinking too much. Martin thought Edward had forgotten what they'd seen. But the package came anyway. Inside, carefully wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a cassette recorder, a cassette labeled Sand Hollow/Site 13/July 1952, and a USGS topographical map folded into quarters. No explanation. No apology. Just a post-it on the back of the tape that read, "Play this alone. And don't stop it." Edward sat down at the old kitchen table, where he'd once calculated rocket fuel ratios and changed diapers, and stared at the machine. It was a Panasonic from the 1970s. Older than most memories, but familiar. He pressed play, and his brother's voice came through the static, clear as morning light in the Mojave. "If you're hearing this, Ed, it means I didn't make it past 78. I'm sorry about that. But you should know, I didn't leave you with just a funeral. I left you with the truth." There was a long pause. A sound of wind. Then the unmistakable hum of desert insects, cicadas, constant and sharp. "Do you remember Sand Hollow? Summer of 52? The project? You were in logistics. I was just a runner, barely 20. But we both knew. There was something off about Site 13. It wasn't on the base map. You had to ask for a separate clearance card just to be driven near it." Edward's hand tightened on the edge of the table. "We saw trucks roll in at night. No headlights. We heard screams. You said it was the coyotes. I said it was people. But the part you didn't know, Ed, is this. I went back. Twice. Once in 59. And again, 10 years ago. It's still there." Another long pause. The wind grew louder. Object 13 wasn't a building. It was a vault. And what they put in it wasn't a bomb. It was memory. The tape clicked. Silence. Edward sat frozen, the hum of the stopped cassette louder than the wind had been. He stood slowly, walked to his garage, and found an old box of files from the 50s, maps, payroll slips, technical memos. None of them had ever mentioned Site 13. But the map that came with the tape was different. Hand-marked. Contours etched in red. Encircled in thick pen, nearly at the edge of the restricted zone. A black square labeled 13. He felt something old stir in his chest. Not fear. Not even anger. Something worse. Recognition. "You were right, Martin," he whispered. "We both knew. We just didn't want to say it." He folded the map, pocketed the cassette, and looked toward the empty hallway. Tomorrow, he'd drive east, back toward Nevada. Back to Sand Hollow. Back to what they were never supposed to find again. The first thing Edward noticed as he crossed into Nevada was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles in a place where something once happened, and no one was allowed to talk about it. He drove along Route 375, past weather-worn signs and old military fencing, following the same stretch of road he hadn't seen since the Eisenhower administration. But the land remembered. Flat plateaus, low desert brush, and the sky, wide and endless, like it had been holding its breath for 70 years. He checked into a roadside motel outside Alamo, a half-abandoned place with yellowing blinds and cracked ice machines. The woman at the front desk looked to be in her 80s, reading a paperback romance with the cover half-torn. "Backpacking?" she asked, not looking up. Edward slid his ID across the counter. "Research." She raised an eyebrow, slowly scanned his name, and paused. "You were military?" "A long time ago." Her voice dropped. "You're not the first one come asking about the test fields. Most of them don't come back twice." He said nothing. She handed him the key, a real one, metal, not plastic, and nodded toward the north window. "You'll see the ridge in the morning. Looks empty. Ain't." The next morning, Edward stood outside his room, hot coffee in hand, staring across the desert scrub. The ridge rose like a tired shoulder in the distance, just as he remembered. Just beyond that hill was where the black square had been marked on Martin's map. Site 13. He pulled the cassette from his pocket again, as if it might somehow grow heavier the closer he got. He played it once more in the car, rolling slowly over dirt trails now swallowed by time. "I went back. Twice, it's still there." He reached the base of the ridge by noon. From there, he walked. He passed the old power pole, half-rotted now, and the stone slab where trucks used to park. He followed the map's red ink through dry gullies and rattlesnake brush until he reached the place where the earth dipped strangely, like a shallow bowl. The air was still. No signs. No fences. Just sand, stone, and one large, square metal plate, flush with the ground. It was rusted but intact. There were no handles. No hinges. Just 4 bolts in each corner, and a number etched into the center. 13. He crouched, ran his fingers over the metal. And then, a noise. Low. Like breathing, if a mountain could breathe. He froze. From beneath the plate came the faintest hum. Not mechanical. Not electronic. It was rhythmic. Slow. Like memory trying to speak. Edward stepped back, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The desert stretched in all directions, empty. Or was it? From the corner of his eye, something moved. He turned sharply. A dust cloud. A distant black truck, parked on the ridge. It wasn't there when he arrived. Someone was watching. The black truck didn't move. It sat like a beetle on the ridge, angled just enough to have a clear view of the hollow. Edward stared at it for a long moment, shielding his eyes from the sun. No motion inside. No dust trail. Whoever was up there had been watching for a while. He turned back to the plate. The hum had stopped. He knelt again, pressing his hand against the metal. It was warm, unnaturally so. The desert hadn't been hot enough yet to bake metal through. This heat came from underneath. That's when he noticed the corner seam. Not a hatch. A panel. He pressed it. It didn't give. Then, from inside his coat, he pulled out the envelope Martin had taped behind the cassette recorder, the one he hadn't dared open until now. Inside was a second cassette, unlabeled, and a folded note. Play only when you reach the door. This one they never recorded in any archive. Edward's hand shook a little as he placed the second tape into the recorder. He hit play. A voice crackled to life. But it wasn't Martin's. It was a woman. Calm. Methodical. Her tone clipped, official, like someone used to speaking through a glass window. June 7, 1952. Experimental Group C, Subject 13. Result: sustained echo memory after audio exposure. Subject's recall of falsified events remains intact, even under sedation. Project notes attached under code. Obsidian. There was a pause. Then static. Then another voice, male, desperate. Where's my sister? You said she was outside. You said she. The woman again. She never existed. Repeat the sequence. I don't understand. You said. Repeat the sequence. Then, screaming. Edward stopped the tape. His breath had gone shallow. He sat back in the dust, staring at the ridge. The truck was gone. No tire tracks. No sound of engine. Just gone. He rewound the tape, fast-forwarded to the end. The last 15 seconds were the same female voice, quieter now. Subject 13 terminated. Transfer of materials to Vault 2 approved. Object 13 sealed indefinitely. He let the recorder fall into his lap. His brother had known, not just about the vault, but about what was done inside. That voice, the boy, had sounded young, barely 15, terrified, and they had erased his life, piece by piece. Edward stood. He wasn't just going to remember now. He was going to unseal the door. But he'd need help. He drove for 6 hours across desert and dust, the kind of drive where the road hums just loud enough to drown out thought. Edward didn't speak. He barely blinked. The second tape replayed in his mind, over and over, the calm voice, the terrified boy, the name, Obsidian. He had seen that name once before. In 1964, on a shredded file that passed his desk for incineration. He hadn't asked questions then. He should have. By dusk, he arrived in a town that barely made the map, Snowfield, Arizona. One post office. One diner. A library closed on Mondays. And a community of people who minded their own history. Her name now was Marion Hale. But in the 1950s, she'd been Lieutenant Margot Halberd, a psychological operations specialist under contract with Sand Hollow Command. Her personnel file ended abruptly in 1960, labeled, separated, no transfer required. That meant, erased. Edward found her at a retirement home nestled beneath red cliffs. He waited for visiting hours, walked in carrying only a small envelope and a name. The nurse said, "She doesn't talk much anymore." Edward nodded. "Maybe she doesn't need to. I just need her to remember." She was sitting by a window, back straight despite the years, her hands folded as if still awaiting orders. Her white hair was pinned neatly. Her eyes, steel blue, didn't waver when he approached. He spoke gently. "Miss Hale." "Nothing." He took the tape recorder from his pocket and pressed play. The voice of the woman, her voice, filled the air. Subject 13 terminated. Transfer of materials to Vault 2 approved. Marian's eyes twitched. Her fingers clenched, just once. Edward leaned in. You said that. 70 years ago. Inside Object 13. Silence. Then, a whisper. He had a sister. Edward's breath caught. Marian looked out the window. She wasn't in the program. He kept repeating her name, over and over. That's what broke the loop. Edward sat beside her. What was her name? She closed her eyes. Clara. It meant nothing to Edward. But to her, to Subject 13, it had meant enough to withstand sedation. Erasure. Programming. I didn't sign the termination order, she whispered. It was already stamped when it reached my desk. I leaked one of the tapes. That's why they erased me. Edward nodded slowly. You gave it to Martin. Marian's lips curled into the faintest smile. He said someone would come. She opened the drawer of her nightstand and removed a small, square object, metal, dented, with a faded government seal. She placed it in his palm. A key. A hex key. Military issue. The kind used for vault locks. There's no door, she said. Only wait. You don't pull it open. You press. Edward rose. Thank you. Marian looked up. If it's still breathing, Ed, you need to finish what we didn't. He didn't ask how she knew his name. Some truths lingered too long to be forgotten. The desert hadn't changed. Neither had the wind, dry, wide, almost reverent. As if it too had been waiting all these years for someone to come back. Edward parked a half-mile from the site, far from view. If the black truck returned, it wouldn't see him coming. He carried only what mattered, the tape recorder, the second cassette, a flashlight, gloves, and the hex key Marian had given him. The hatch still lay flat under the sky, its rusted edges kissing the sand like a sealed confession. He knelt, brushing away the dust. This time, he found it, a hidden keyhole beneath a welded plate on the northwest corner. Tiny, precise, only visible in the right light. He inserted the key. It turned with a mechanical sigh. A click echoed under the ground, soft, but final. Then, nothing. Until the sand shifted. Not much. Just a breath's worth of movement, then a soft hiss. The hatch, slowly, impossibly, sank inward, like the desert exhaling. What rose in its place was a narrow metal stairwell, cold to the touch despite the heat above. Edward turned on his flashlight. Every instinct told him not to go down. He went anyway. The air inside was still. No cobwebs. No signs of wildlife. Just a silence so thick, it pressed against the eardrums. He descended 27 steps. Then he saw it. A corridor. Narrow. Steel-paneled. Lined with faded stencils, obsidian, Section C. At the end stood a single door, paint peeled, a small window fogged with time. He pushed it open. Inside, the walls were lined with machines, reel-to-reel tape recorders, monitors, control panels from another century. Most were dark. One wasn't. A lone red light blinked on an active tape deck. It was still recording. His breath caught. He pressed stop, then rewind, then play. A boy's voice filled the room, young, cracked with fear. She was wearing yellow. She had the ribbon. Clara always had the ribbon. You saw her, didn't you? You saw. Another voice cut in, Marian's, younger and colder. Clara does not exist. Repeat sequence. The boy screamed. Edward stepped back, his stomach tightening. This wasn't a memory. This was a loop. The machine had been recording and replaying nonstop for 73 years. He scanned the rest of the room. On one wall, faded photographs. Dozens of children's faces. None labeled. None smiling. On the far side of the room stood a cabinet, locked. He pried it open. Inside were folders. Real names. Medical histories. One labeled Subject 13, A.L. He opened it. Name, Andrew Lyman. Age, 14. Status, non-responsive. Memory protocol failed. Transfer denied. Next of kin, Clara Lyman, sister, non-subject. Beneath the folder, a ribbon. Faded yellow. Edward touched it, and for the first time in hours, spoke aloud. He remembered her. Even when they didn't. And that was why they buried this place. He emerged into the sun with his jacket stuffed with files, the yellow ribbon carefully tucked between pages. The desert air burned his lungs. Not from heat, but from what he now carried. As he reached the ridge line, something shifted in the light. A figure stepped from behind a rusted military jeep. Black windbreaker. Aviators. Mid-60s. Calm. Not law enforcement. Not military. Worse. Private. The man said nothing at first. Just looked Edward over, like inspecting an old document. Then, "You weren't supposed to get in." Edward said nothing. The man nodded toward the files. "You found subject 13? Edward gripped the edge of the case tighter. His name was Andrew. The man sighed. "You know how many men died just to keep that door closed?" Edward's voice cracked. "You mean children?" The wind howled between them. "Whatever you're holding," the man said, "it's older than justice. Let it go." Edward shook his head. "My brother didn't." At that, the man actually smiled. "No, he didn't. That's why we stopped watching him." "You think I'm afraid of being disappeared?" Edward asked. "No, we don't make people disappear anymore, Mr. Brewer. We let them speak, and we bury them in the noise." He stepped back toward his vehicle. "You've got one tape. You've got one story. Make it count." Then he was gone. No fight. No gun. No threat. That was worse. Edward stood in the dust for a long time. And then he made a choice. He drove to the nearest city, rented a room, hooked his old recorder into a digital interface, and uploaded the entire recording, Marion's voice, Andrew's cries, the name Obsidian, to 3 different platforms, encrypted and time-released. Then he pressed play on Martin's third tape, which had been hidden inside the recorder all along, under the battery flap. His brother's voice again. Softer. Tired. "If you're hearing this, Ed, you did it. I'm proud of you. I know you think this ends with the tape, but it doesn't. There's one more place. One more piece. Check the back of the folder marked Clara." Edward turned to the files. Opened the folder. Inside was a photo, black and white, curled at the edges. A girl, standing at a gate, holding a ribbon. Her face, clear. But behind her, in the corner of the photo, was a sign, not government issued. A wooden marker. It read, "Project Shelter, Timberline." And underneath, in faded stencil, "Property of Obsidian Group. Do not transfer." A second location. A second memory. A second child. Edward's hands trembled. He hadn't unsealed the vault. He'd opened the first door. Timberline wasn't on the map. Not anymore. It took Edward nearly 4 days of searching through old land deeds, declassified WPA documents, and cemetery transfer records. Most of them led nowhere. Until one article, dated 1951, mentioned a Timberline shelter school built in northern New Mexico for displaced or war-affected miners. The school had burned in 1959. No survivors listed. No photographs. No follow-up. But the coordinates were still there, buried in a ledger from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Not even Obsidian had scrubbed them all. Edward parked at the edge of a pine forest. The air was cold here, different from the desert. Wet, heavy. The kind of air that carried echoes. He hiked 2 miles into the woods, the ground giving under his boots, branches creaking like bones. Then, through the trees, stone. A foundation. Broken steps. A rusted bell. And a signpost, barely legible. Timberline. He walked the perimeter. There were no graves. But there were indentations, 11 of them, evenly spaced. Some with stone markers. None with names. He placed the photo of Clara in the center of the site. And the ribbon, just beside it. That's when he heard the voice. Faint. A child's. She wore yellow. She always wore yellow. He turned sharply. No one. Just the wind. Or maybe, memory. Edward knelt and began digging where the central marker sat. Not deep, just beneath the surface. His fingers struck metal. A box. Locked, but old. He pried it open. Inside, a small stack of drawings. Crayons. Childlike. Each with a name. Clara. 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 One had a son. One had a house. And one had a girl standing next to a boy. Andrew. Behind the drawings, a torn piece of paper with government print. An internal memo. Project Obsidian. Subject 13 memory tether remains stable. Recommend sibling relocation to Timberline shelter. No further testing. They hadn't erased Clara. They'd moved her. They'd planned to use her next. Edward sat back, when shaking the trees above him. He had enough now. The drawings. The memo. The names. He packed it carefully. Then, using his old contacts and the help of one retired journalist who still believed in consequences, Edward released everything. Every tape. Every image. Every file. It made the news for 36 hours. Then it vanished. Buried again in the noise of the internet. But not forgotten. Because 2 weeks later, A woman in Missouri, born in 1946, adopted with no records, always haunted by dreams of deserts and ribbons, saw the drawings. She recognized the face. And she remembered the name. Andrew. He called me Clara. Edward flew to see her. She was frail now, but her voice was clear. He protected me. That's why I was moved. Edward took her hand. He remembered you, even when they told him not to. They sat for hours, not talking about programs or protocols or secrets, just memories, the kind you don't erase, the kind that survive vaults, decades, and silence, the kind worth finding.